In which case, generally, this is when a UX expert comes in to now create the experience for this product to work great for the consumers. So today's topic, we're going to be discussing product ownership, all the general resources involved in the process of creating a product, the titles, the responsibilities, and then how do all these things kind of connect together. But the main key is about, having product ownership and, bringing product from start to finish. Hi, Lane. Welcome back. Always.
Hi, Yuri. Nice to talk to you again.
Last time we started talking a little bit about product ownership. And so I wanted to dive deep into what's involved, what type of resources it requires to innovate, conceptualize, develop, and launch a product. Product can be anything. It could be a website, an app, a physical product, even a marketing campaign, right? But at the end of the day, whatever that product is, you need ownership. There's been a lot of confusion between where a product manager fits in versus a project manager. And then there's always a UX designer stuck in the middle. And for many companies, UX designers kind of wind up taking on the role of both product and project managers. And I wanted to clarify that a little bit. Product manager is generally a resource that's responsible for the actual product, for the ideation and the communication with the stakeholders, to try to figure out the business side. How does the product fit in with the business and has an impact on the business? What are the limitations, budgetary limitations? What are the innovation opportunities, right? When a product person really is thinking about how this product will play out in the real world. And then once all those thoughts are put together, they are passed on to a project manager. And a project manager's responsibility is usually assigning proper resources, a schedule, and management of the budget to produce this product. In which case, generally, this is when a UX expert comes in to now create the experience for this product to work great for the consumers. But then usually most stakeholders just go straight to the UX person, and then the UX person is responsible to figure all this stuff out. So I wanted to get that, kind of clarity that most products require multitude of resources to be generated, and so that, people lay off the UX people a little bit. And
Well, I think oftentimes you talk a little bit about the things that the product manager is responsible for gathering. And oftentimes in my experience, that's usually the requirements. They're kind of responsible for being the holding tank for the technical requirements, and the business requirements, and the user requirements. Right. But so often the UX designer has to be the loudest person in the room to get anybody to take the user requirements seriously. It's really difficult. User requirements are often so much more nebulous. They're oftentimes, framed around ideal visions, whereas business requirements and technical requirements are very concrete. They're very immovable because you're living those in the day-to-day business culture. And so if you're not sort of already a human-centered business, it can be really difficult for the user requirements to really get the appropriate weight at the table. With the product manager, in your experience with e-commerce, do you typically find that product managers own the whole e-commerce site? Or are there situations where certain people are tasked with certain types of experiences across the e-commerce?
So the product manager should be tasked with the entire e-commerce experience, because the product manager needs to understand that how does this product tie in to everything else, right? Particularly in e-commerce, you have things like logistics, operations, customer service. There's tons of issues even when it comes to returns or certain policies. Different case scenarios, they all revolve around this e-commerce product, right? If that's the centerfold. And today specifically, right, with people going through digital transformation, e-commerce will be their storefront for most of the businesses. And so a product manager needs to keep in mind what happens on the consumer side, what happens on the marketing side, what happens on the logistics and merchandising side, as far as cohesive experience, right? The ecosystem. But then the consumer experience needs to fall into the UX hands with the product manager's oversight, right? I think user experience needs to dictate that consumer interaction and should take a little bit more authority over the product managers, because UX is much closer to the consumer side than the product person.
I mean, you sort of ended on, I think, a really important note, which is like this whole element of like the putting the people at the heart of the business, like putting your consumer at the heart. So when you're making decisions, you're really thinking at the core, like, is this going to be, at least you're accurately weighing like the outcomes of those requirements. It might make sense to invest more in like a service or some kind of additional feature that's like brand specific, because you can see long term that like that's the expectation that the consumer is going to have when they're shopping for your particular product. But oftentimes that might, if you aren't doing user research and like really working to get that data into your company, that's like both anecdotal, talking about the experiences that people have, how they're perceiving your touch points.
Right.
If you aren't doing the work to bring that information in, then so often the business requirements just usurp everything, because you don't have the right balance of understanding like where do we need to deliver a really unique and specialized experience versus like how are we maintaining brand value, making investments in infrastructure. And oftentimes those business requirements are so tech focused, like, when you're making major decisions about like payment processing on the back end, it can be really hard to see how those decisions are going to bubble up into the user experience. But if your product manager is really people driven, then like those conversations are happening really early in the decision-making process. And I think it's easier to see it play out in a healthy balance as the project comes to a conclusion.
Right. One of the key responsibilities of a product manager, and that the ownership of the product manager, is to be aware that you don't need to build, the entire product and all the bells and whistles in the first run, right? And I think this is where product managers usually are worth the money, right? They're worth the investment, is because they know that most stakeholders, most entrepreneurs, most business owners, they get so excited when they want to launch a new product, or they want to just build this massive website with all these features, and they don't even know if these features are necessary, if it's worth the investment, right? So the product manager needs to break it into phases and say, this is how we get to the MVP. This is how we get it enough for us to put it in front of consumers, test it out, see the feedback, make adjustments before we start dressing it up. It's a very key factor, particularly with like emerging tech. We're actually dealing with one startup today who wants to just dying to incorporate artificial intelligence into the process, and I'm like, you don't need it. It will be cool. We'll do it later. Just hold on. Let us get through phase one. Let's get you users. Let's get you sales. The sales will come, right? Like his product is very good, so sales will come just through a standard experience, right? But then when you add a little bit of an AI component, computer vision component that makes it more cooler, a little bit faster, it's definitely going to help, but it's not necessary for phase one. It's not necessary to get them out of the gate.
Yeah.
So that's
as somebody who used to work in an agency, like our roadmap, it was like a joke. Save that for phase two. It was like just this.
Let's not name agency names.
Honestly, on a couple of projects, that like phase two was just like a draft email. I was just dumping things. Every time we would say that, okay, I'm just going to store it here just in case we ever get the chance to come back around to it. But that was kind of like the nature of the agency that I worked in. And oftentimes what we would see is that companies would have retainers for us for like, regular maintenance and just some month-to-month hours. But the cost of like maintaining the technical requirements was so high that there was just really rarely ever any room for UX other than having, a UX person kind of weigh in on technical decisions that were being made, but they weren't coming from like a human driven
I'm going to tell you something.
perspective.
I'm going to tell you something that I generally like to exercise. Unfortunately, I don't know if it resonates well with a lot of people, but I love going by the rule of the, brutal honesty. And so my brutal honesty, I've said this to a number of companies. When you're investing, I want to continue stressing the fact that they're investing into products, right? Or into technology or into experiences. When you're investing into something, you can feed two things. You can feed your ego, or you could feed your bank account. And that's a huge difference, okay? Not a lot of people really like that, but it's a fact, right? You want something that you want, and just because you're the stakeholder and it's your business, it's your baby, and you just want to see it. Experts, people that don't have any relationship to your product or to your business, on an emotional level, will tell you that externally that it doesn't make sense. It's a poor investment. So we can, a lot of times people are just forced into building things they don't want to build, designing things they don't want to design, right? Like how many times, somebody says, oh, I want to design and shove all of these options into one screen and just let it look like what Yahoo used to look like back in the day, So.
You mean what Amazon looks like now?
Well, yeah, it goes to Yahoo anyways.
But I've often referred to that kind of on the same sentiment as you don't want to get too married to an idea. Oftentimes when you're presenting design work and you're like sort of, actively incorporating feedback and looking for criticism of your work, it can be really easy to always give like a but and kind of, response to things that people are saying. But if you kind of put that ego aside and you're not too invested in the idea, you just let it stand on its own, you'll have a much different relationship. What kind of, like when you are working with like product and project managers, what do you find is similar and different about their approach to like structuring a project? When you talk about using like Kanban or Agile or Scrum or these are, sort of categories, but as everybody knows, like there's a scale that Agile is practiced on, and oftentimes a waterfall, with some Agile sprinkled in. Have you noticed any patterns of behavior?
I think again, this is just from our experience. I think Agile is definitely the more preferred method, and more agencies and more companies are adopting it. Nothing is ever set in stone, so you have to be able to adapt and pivot, right? So it's very important to keep emotions out of the process, so that and opinions have to be valued but measured, right? Because you'll have a project, it's very easy to fall into the your own biases and into your own ideas, right? Especially for project managers, right? They start getting so deep and so so attached to their process, and sometimes it's very hard to break them out of it, right? So I constantly remind my guys that, look, emotions are great, opinions are great, doesn't mean that you're right all the times, right? So you have to be able to pivot, right? So an agile process allows you to pivot faster and lower the cost factors and the risk factors of failure. Do you have a preference? What is your preference? What are your thoughts on this?
I prefer always starting like any kind of phase of the project with as much information and data as possible, and that includes user research and usability testing. Because oftentimes, you'll start a project where you're looking at like search history on the site. You're looking at the Google Analytics, and so you can kind of see how people are moving around. But I think like a true digital transformation always incorporates that storytelling element of data that's often overlooked. But the problem is like sometimes doing that research, it requires like a little bit of planning. It requires some budget depending on what you're doing. Maybe you have to.
So this is interesting. I'm going to interrupt you for a second. I apologize, but it's a very interesting part. So I'd like you to just dive in a little bit of an importance factor in that research phase, right? So a lot of stakeholders don't truly understand this discovery phase, this research phase that designers have to go through. They just think it's pushing buttons. Unfortunately, no disrespect to anyone, but in my experience, it's like when they see the outcome, they're like, oh, okay, I could have done that in Paint. Like,
yeah, it's like of course we should be doing that. Why
yeah,
wouldn't
it's
we?
easy.
Yeah.
You know, coming to a conclusion of of a
Yeah.
beautiful product, functional product,
Yeah.
you know, a product that has logic and common sense
Mhm.
and purpose behind it. It has so much baggage to
Yeah.
get to it, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah,
This is
bag.
important.
I don't know that I would use the word bag.
It's baggage. Listen, it's hours of
it's
research
it's
and learning
it's
and
sense
discovery.
making. It's that's the
Sense making.
diplomatic.
That's
It's sense
the PC
making.
term is sense making.
Yes.
Okay.
No matter what you do, you're having tons of information thrown at you all the time. I mean, even if you choose not to do usability testing or any kind of user research, like you're still having conversations with people who know a lot about their job. You're still looking at data about what's happening on the website. So you're getting information about the what. You're hearing about the assumptions and the things. And we've talked about this before, but the people inside your organization, they're experts on the customer. Like that should be acknowledged. But there are so many other political forces and like headwinds that you're dealing with inside of an organization that if you're not making an effort to really do something that's like human centered and like bringing in those stories about your customers to talk about why people are doing stuff, to observe how they're responding to the brand, how they're responding to the experience of purchasing something from you. You're not going to get that like emotional connection that I think is really critical. We've talked a lot about like where design fits into digital transformation, and I think it's not so much these hard skills of like producing graphic assets, selecting typography, creating the rules and the style guidelines. It's also about the soft skills that often aren't really seen on a day-to-day basis because they are the things that facilitate the creation of the deliverables. So they're the things that make the soft skills make space for that sense making to happen so that you can get to the deliverables. Keeping that in mind, if you're not making space for the customer's voice in your decision-making process, then it's not going to naturally happen there. And so that's why when you're looking at that data and you're iterating through an e-commerce project, having the what, the Google Analytics, the search keywords that you're seeing to influence, any navigational changes you might be making. You also want to balance that with like just really simple user tests. I mean, honestly, putting your e-commerce site in front of somebody on a different team, or maybe, the barista at the coffee shop down the street, like just having somebody and kind of framing it, saying to them, like, all I really need you to do is pretend like you're going to go and buy a bracelet on this website for Mother's Day. And let me just ask you some questions about your experience as you click through things. And then you can kind of guide them, like, you're looking for a bracelet, if the bracelet is a gift. So kind of setting up those contextual components, you can get a wealth of information, just from doing that once or twice. Two people with the same directives will end up in completely different parts of the site. And you just won't know what that looks like unless you're actually getting in front of people.
Right. And can I just add on? And
Yeah.
in today's world, you can also, we like to, in addition to user interviews, we also like to do, for established businesses, we like to run some like screen recordings, heat maps, and just paying attention, to what people, draw themselves to, right? What are they clicking on? What's important to them? That allow, all of this information gathering happens in a background, right? This happens, before a pixel is even pushed in any direction. So once that one, and I just want to make sure that, like, the audience that is listening to us, hopefully the brands and the companies, understands that before you get to see anything, there's so much research and content gathering and analysis that happens, so that we can make smart decisions into creating the right user experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, is that like because all of this stuff is happening in the background and it's sense making activities, like oftentimes it's not, like if you're not making space for it, it's probably not going to happen. And so as an organization, if you are in a leadership position or you're overseeing a team, it's sort of your responsibility to create that culture or to expect that people will do this. Like oftentimes UX designers, you'll see that they have this this research skill, but it's just not being leveraged within the organization because the people who are responsible for the decisions aren't requesting that information from their team. You know, they're not like tasking somebody to go out and gather this and bring it back to them. So when you don't have that kind of leadership that's like looking for that kind of data or for that kind of storytelling, then, you know, it's not going to happen organically, I think.
Right. And I think this is where product managers also come in very handy because they expect this type of research and information, right? So, you know, we're talking about product ownership. It's not, who kicks off the project. It's who monitors this entire project, right? As it progresses, right? So the product manager needs to consistently pull resources, pull data, pull information to improve the product, you know, from market research, from data analytics, from user experience research, from any existing, you know, trackable software. Like, you know, the product manager always puts this back into the product, and whether the product is new or existing that can be improved, right? The product manager, the ownership of the product manager requires them to keep continuously call on this type of information.
Yeah, you make a really good point. I think that these research methodologies, whether they're qualitative or quantitative, have matured immensely over the past decade. I mean, you've just seen a flood in every different skill, in every different industry, of new ways of gathering information, new ways of making sense of data, new ways of storytelling. So you have all these like tools and techniques now, and as the product manager, I think it's kind of your responsibility to understand how to pull from those different research methodologies and put it together so you're getting the insights that you want, so that you're fleshing out biases and assumptions of people on the team. That's a really critical skill. Very difficult to do. I mean, it's hard if you're not used to leveraging an A/B test to know when to do it, how to execute it. But like A/B testing in e-commerce is very important. And
100%.
some platforms are really great about offering it now. That's another area of maturity over the past couple of years. Salesforce Commerce Cloud has a really great A/B testing module. MailChimp for your emails has great testing. That's definitely something when you're planning a project to think about is how are the platforms supporting the data gathering that I need.
Correct. So that's why it's very, very critical to have a product manager at the helm. We are open to questions. If anybody has, right, you know, just put in the comments.
Yeah, post them in the comments.
Post them in the comments, or you could, you know, shoot an email to hello@nanowebgroup.com. We're always happy to respond. E-commerce lives in so many places, right? Even nonprofit organizations that do online donations, you cannot accept donations without e-commerce. Right. So what systems supported? There's actually a lot of processing companies that work really well with nonprofits and give them such a huge break on processing fees and additional fees that, you know, these processing companies love to charge. Even taking, you know, like even B2B, right? In some cases, B2B, trying to keep your like retail distribution, right? Consistently working with you, you know, reordering, tracking their orders, tracking their sales, you know, tracking their best sellers. It helps, right? It's all e-commerce related. And now healthcare is getting into it more, right? With telehealth becoming a big deal. You know, you still got a bill for the virtual consultations. Been talking to some law firms, and we're going to be helping a law firm set up a telehealth type of a format where they could also book consultations, virtual consultations online, get paid for it, right? You know, even though they're sitting at home in pajamas doing nothing, you know, they could still offer legal help. Lots of opportunities may come.
Oftentimes those opportunities, they don't, you know, that you need an interaction designer when you like start to string together all of these platforms to like deliver on the service that you've positioned or the product that you're offering in this online market. But you know that the role of a UX designer, it might shift to something more of like a service designer, because now you're looking at how all of these different services are like tied together to create an ecosystem for your brand. And so I think it's kind of interesting to look at like the different branches of UX design that have kind of emerged over the years, and how the kind of the terminology has been applied in like the service design space or the customer experience space. There's a lot of real serious overlap, even though you're applying the tools in different contexts.
Right. we also need to dig in a little bit into the difference between UX designer and a UI designer
Yeah. Oh, no.
and a graphic designer.
Yeah.
So,
An information designer.
information designer, right? So,
Yeah.
nothing is straightforward, and it's never a one size fits all. It's never a
No.
one man army. Takes
No.
a team, takes the right resources, takes, and depends on the right project. And I
Right
think the
skills.
most important, right, the skills is one thing, but most importantly is mindset. I'm just going to
Yeah.
add one
Totally.
more point, and then we're going to wrap it up, is that,
Yeah.
we used to, when we were starting out, we were always being compared to, like outsourced companies overseas versus US, right? Brands always trying to save money on, because, look, New York agencies, they're not cheap. They're not the cheapest. It's a known fact. But, and competing with, prices in India is absurd. You should never compete.
Yeah, but you're not going to get the right quality.
Right. But outside of the quality, the biggest problem is that cultural understanding. Right? They don't live in a culture that we live in, and our culture requires a different mindset to understand the consumer, right? Frankly, we're spoiled, right? In America, everybody's spoiled. We get everything at any time. Amazon spoiled us so badly. Netflix spoiled us. You get everything in an instance. If Netflix is not loading within 3 seconds, we're complaining. If Amazon Prime cannot ship in 2 days, we're like,
you're like, forget it. I'm not even going to bother.
Right. Versus cultural, right? And again, it's not a bias. It's just a fact. Or that, like in countries like India or other third world type of countries, they're used to a lower level expectations, and they're not so spoiled. So their tolerance level is much lower. So they always worry about function rather than an experience, right? Oh, this button works. Who cares if it looks like crap, right?
Yeah, or it's in completely the wrong place.
Right, or that it's in the wrong place. Like, it's there.
No one can find it, but it works. Right. So great.
Use your head, find it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that cultural difference made a big deal, and so the mindset, right? This is just an example, right? So when you're building a team to, when you're constructing a team to work on your product, you need the team with the right mindset, right? If you're a luxury brand and you're gonna hire, a bunch of designers that couldn't care less for luxury, they're not going to design you an experience that, will resonate with people that care about luxury, or, techies, or, if you're doing something that has a great humanitarian impact, right? If you're going to get a designer that all they care about is, flashy, expensive things, they're very unlikely to care about whether a tree gets cut down and, the water gets polluted, right? So putting the right teams together to design takes a mindset as well, right? You got to
absolutely,
connect the dots.
Cool.
So that's just my 2 cents. But
it's very useful. It's a good perspective, I think.
Yeah, because I think that's in the perspective to keep in mind for brands when they are shopping around for the right team, right? They shouldn't be shopping around just for the skills or just price. They should truly interview companies and, designers and developers and product and project managers to understand, like, what do you care about? What's important to you? Will you be the right fit for my company as a team, even if it's a temporary project? Like, it's super important.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much about that connection,
Thank you again, as always.
Yes, thank you, Yuri. It's always wonderful to talk to you.
That's right. Well, till next time.
Yes, until next time.
Bye.
Bye.